Right. So we're talking about meditations. I just want to start by giving a few notes before the presentation, just a little bit of context. Much of this presentation was inspired by Michael Sergru's lecture on Marcus Aurelius. I attempted to rephrase as much as possible, but I kind of couldn't resist in quoting him directly sometimes, like in just literally copying verbatim. I ask you to keep that in mind. I will also provide a link to the lecture at the end of the presentation so you can enjoy it for yourselves because it's fantastic. It's really, 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 really good. I will be alternating between a script and improv. This will be a dense lecture and I will do my utmost to strike a balance between narration and dialogue, but I may not succeed. I must also confess that the script is probably not the best. I kind of rushed this a little bit, but I will do my best to kind of cover everything. In the context of honesty, right? I used AI in certain sections to assist me with selecting quotes. This is because I'm mentioning this because it would go against the spirit of literally what I'm about to present. To pretend that everything I will say originated solely from my mind. I did need some help in some things, and I'm here to advocate for these ideas and not just discuss them. These are principles I try to live by, and I truly believe in them. And therefore, I'm not merely a bystander here, just narrating history or explaining philosophy, but rather also a man laying out his own beliefs. I also want to say that I take no shame in any of this, but I would feel remiss if I didn't mention this, right? So let us start. Stoicism as a fragment of Socratic thinking. So it is important to contextualize Stoicism as a sort of continuation of Hellenistic thinking, particularly as a descendant of Socratic ideas. With the disappearance of Socratic thinking, with the death of Plato and Socrates, and the fall of the Hellenistic world, three major philosophies appeared, like splinters from Socratic thinking. The first one would be Epicureanism, which is to an extent like a sort of proto-hedonistic idea as we know it today. I'm sure that you are familiar with Epicureanism to some degree, but if you're not, like, it's basically a sort of, in a sense, a continuation of Socratic prudence allied to the ideas of pleasure, right? Socratic prudence would be this sort of idea of, I will drink, but I will not drink so much that I would have a hangover. I enjoy the drinking, it's a pleasure, but I will never abuse it in so much that it will cause me a sort of pain afterwards, right? So Epicureanism, particularly when it applies to pleasures, kind of might stem from the Socratic prudence, because the pleasure garden of an Epicureanist is the place where he enjoys his pleasures, but never into an excessive amount, right? Pleasure is an ultimate good, but it's an ultimate good that needs to be moderated, and one can understand it as stemming from Socratic thinking. The other one would be cynicism, as a continuation of the Socratic inquiry, right? The process of constantly questioning everything that we do and how we do it. But unlike Socratic thinking, cynicism is not really concerned with the search for truth, but rather the shielding of the need to seek truth in and of itself. It's quite almost like a negation of the Socratic resolution of the process of inquiry. So we can never be certain of anything, because we can always forever question everything. And then finally, there's Stoicism. So let's talk about the Stoics a little bit, as we will inevitably develop ideas about Stoicism. There haven't been many Stoics, right? And the few of them that are worth remembering, two in particular stand out. One would be Epictetus, and the other one, Marcus Aurelius. And the pleasant irony that highlights the virtues of Stoicism, and of philosophy in general, like as a sort of ultimately equalizing force, is that Epictetus was a slave and Marcus Aurelius an emperor, right? And yet, in some profound sense, if these two were ever to meet, they couldn't really help but to see each other as equals and have deep, profound respect for one another. So let's talk a little bit about Marcus Aurelius, as he's necessarily the most interesting of the two, right? A man that basically has everything, that could possibly have everything, and still remains perfectly disciplined in everything that he does, through a sort of philosophical mindset and a philosophical conception of life. So Marcus Aurelius was born in Rome on April 26th, 121 AD, during the rise of Christianity in the empire. The role that Christianity played during his rule was very somewhat important, at least historically, but because Marcus Aurelius, even though he was personally tolerant of different religions, he didn't stop the localized but systematic persecution of Christians in some of the areas of the empire, right? So this is a sort of hallmark of his reign as an emperor, and he elaborates on some reasons as to why he doesn't really agree with Christians throughout the book, but that's not really relevant. It's just to give you a little bit of historical context. An example of this, though, that I can give is just that faith as a sort of profound embodiment of the virtue of Christianity, or one of the most profound virtues of Christianity, was deeply antagonistic to the entirely reason-driven method of living of Marcus Aurelius. So there are certain passages in the book where he actively criticizes this sort of conception of the world. And this, again, is just a little fragment of information that may be relevant as we go on to read some of the passages of the book, and something important to consider as we interpret his own thoughts. So he rose to power through a chain of adoptions, as it was customary in the empire at the time, having been adopted by Antoninus Pius, the emperor before him, which was subsequently adopted by Hadrian before him. So he's part of a great chain of really reasonable, intelligent, competent men, and that shows. So he grew up particularly interested in poetry, philosophy, and the sort of more, how should I say, intellectual pursuits in life. And he had to eventually abandon these things to learn about the art of war and statesmanship from some of the best educators in the empire. And he rose to his duty beautifully. He ended up being the last of the 5 good emperors. The highlights of his rule were that he passed several legal reforms. He was particularly passionate about pro-social behavior and a fundamentally humanistic conception of morality. His legal reforms reflected this through the humanization of the legal system, the protections of slaves that were added into law, and the support for orphans. He also passed many administrative reforms that promoted efficiency, the reduction of corruption, and the appointing of very competent leaders for different provinces. And he was particularly mindful of duty and responsibility in leadership, but not only in leadership, as we will see, and that showed in his decisions to make these reforms. And finally, as he was presiding over a period of great strife with the Antonine Plague and the wars against the German peoples, he was in fact particularly active during his battle, in writing, during his battles against the Quadi. He strengthened the army and led many campaigns against Germanic peoples and the Parthian Empire, leading personally into battle. He managed to do all of this without substantially overloading the tax system, which once again reflected his view on efficiency on the part of the state and his view on good governance. So, elaborating on the man, the Stoic, we go through the book, and the moral affirmations of Marcus Aurelius throughout the book were varied, reflected a pool of thoughts and ideas that I think plagued him for his whole life. And I use plagued him not so much as a sort of pejorative word, as something that he was fighting against, but rather that's something he was doing his utmost to embrace and live truthfully to. So these ideas are things like duty, temperance, justice, reason, union with nature, among others. And I believe that the most important and foundational idea is that a man should live according to what is good, and whatever he may do, he must live in accordance to nature, reason being the nature of man. And this is a very important cornerstone of everything Stoic. and we will discuss this as we go through the passages of the book and the contents, but I need you to keep this in mind. I also want to just mention that some aspect of this lecture will be somewhat circular. We will constantly revisit the same themes over and over again from different perspectives, and I'm sorry if this might end up getting repetitive, but fundamentally the nature of the book does not allow for something incredibly straightforward. This is not a set of ideas that has a set of logical sequences that leads to a conclusion, but it's rather a holistic way of being. And so everything is interconnected. This is a web of ideas, and everything feeds into everything else. But yeah, so like the Stoic is the man who lives such that he does not disappoint himself. In fact, this is the one true thing that there is a sort of moral negative weight to the Stoic ideal. It's like the idea that you would disappoint yourself, that you would live against your own character, against your own reason, against your own nature. Again, reason being the nature of man. Such that he may preserve his dignity and innocence. And again, innocence here, I mean innocence in the sense that once you do something, you will never be the person that never did that thing. Once you sell your own standards, your own values, your own soul, even if you may regain it later, you will never be the person that never did those things. Like a child that is forced to face the evils of the world, you will lose your innocence, you will lose that dreamlike quality of existing in something that is holy and good, right? And so this sort of sense of innocence as the sort of fundamental absence of everything that is bad in your history of actions is something that is very important, that will then relate to regrets and other emotions that are important to consider. And fundamentally, he lives to conquer his own respect, again, like I just said. So a Stoic is a man that's conquered fear, his own needs, death, and anything that may swerve him off the path of doing what he must according to his reason, according to the nature of man. So in this, he decided that what is good is to maintain a certain level of mental order through the distillation of action, right? Focused, directed, and relentless action into a clear distinction between what he can do and what he can't control, such that he only focus. He would only focus on what he can control, into what is pro-social, into what is reasonable, into what is divine, into what is natural, into what is one's duty, one's absence of anger, into his own thoughts, the virtues displayed by him and the people around him, into accepting death in natural phenomena, and fundamentally into a universalist view of mankind. And there's a certain point at which we kind of think to ourselves, like, how could there ever been such a man as this, right? And obviously there's a certain degree of exaggeration in the representation of anyone when it comes to something like this, right? It's hard to believe that anyone could ever be this kind of person. And what I hope to give you guys that by the end of is that by the end of this lecture, you come to believe that there really was ever one person like this, and that was Marcus Aurelius, right? I do not come from I've investigated multiple historical records as part of the study of this, and really everything that is said about the man at his own time is consistent with his own philosophy. He not only talks the talk, he walks the walk. He never says that others must be like this, but never himself. Right? And I think that this is something deeply profound that is worth considering before we step into the teachings that he has to offer. I mean, teachings, as we will see, these are not necessarily teachings by the nature of what the book is and who it is for, but we will cover that later. So he is fundamentally a silver man in Plato's division between gold being the reason, silver being the soul or the spirit, and bronze being the body and the carnal desires, like the flesh, the desires of the flesh. Marcus Aurelius was a man that used everything he could to save his own soul, right? He's very spirited in that sense, and Stoicism ends up being a great philosophical framework for leaders, military men, public officials, politicians that choose to live in a way or in such a way that they don't disgrace themselves. Okay? And this is why he is such a great example, right? And he was a man that was ever only interested in philosophy and in living the philosophical life. And in a sense, because he only wanted these things, he ended up being born with the misfortune of becoming the emperor of Rome, right? Which is something very interesting to consider, that he never really wanted this kind of responsibility. He never ever wanted to deal with the people that he had to deal with, because everybody came to him only to ask for things in a rude way, in a demanding way, and he had to put up with all of that. He fundamentally never really wanted any of that, but he understood it to be his duty. That providence, as we shall see later, made him become this kind of man, because the buck stops with him. He's got no one else to complain to, and he's responsible for all these people. So he has to be this kind of way. And he was a man who was effectively born with this misfortune of being the emperor of Rome. And he also understood what greatness is, which is the realization that virtue in and of itself was enough, right? That living virtuously is in and of itself the biggest reward that one can have. And virtue is, in the Stoic conception of things, is an organized soul that pursues rationally the things that are good for all human beings. This, when I say virtue, I need you guys to remember this. This is the Stoic conception of virtue. There's a quote by Lord Acton where he once said that power corrupts and absolute power corrupts absolutely. And there is only one exception to that, and that's Marcus Aurelius. And again, might sound a bit exaggerated, but I think that I will be able to show you that this is actually true. Because most emperors would live scandalous lives, focused on pleasures and their own interests, and living life in whatever way they desired. And yet, here's Marcus. He could have had anything from England to Egypt. And yet, he was happy with his lot, and he wanted nothing more than to do what his soul commanded him to do. So, let's start with this idea of the distinction between what one can control and what one cannot, as I think that that's the other cornerstone of the Stoic way of living, which I might add as a sort of aside is a very interesting connection between Western philosophy and Eastern philosophy, right? Like if you were to study Buddhism or something like that, this idea of you being powerless against fate and having to embrace the things that you cannot control and act upon the things that you can control, I think is an interesting bridge between the Western world and the Eastern world. Somewhat tangential, obviously not complete, not to the same depth that Eastern philosophies would explore this idea. But it is a good starting point, and it is something that I think, particularly in the Western world, could have been explored a bit more deeply. But Marcus Aurelius kind of touches on that sort of enlightened, spiritual, Eastern conception of one's own place in the world. And again, these ideas are endlessly repeated throughout the book. And I could have picked so many different quotes to explain these ideas. I might not have picked the most beautiful or the most thorough, but again, I think that these illustrate the point pretty well. So the first quote would be, you have to realize that what happens externally to you is not the problem. The problem is your judgment about it. And this you can erase right now. If the external causes you distress, it is not the thing itself that troubles you, but your judgment of it. And this judgment is something you have the power to revoke at any moment. So this is our first quote, and I want to break this down a little bit because, again, to relate this back to this idea of accepting the things that we can control and the things that we cannot, Marcus Aurelius places our own agency in the embrace of the things that we cannot control, the rejection of any moral weight being placed on these things. In fact, there are many quotes throughout the book in which he highlights that good things and bad things happen to good men and bad men. And so we cannot say that these things are either good and bad, because and this will relate to the ideas of providence that we will cover shortly, but there's a certain assumption that you have your own fate that is designed by you by the gods, and there's a perfect order of which you are part of. And if these things happen to you, then they happen to you as parts of this divine order. And so these things can never be either good or bad because they happen to everybody. And so placing moral weight on it is pretty much futile. So he, in this quote, clearly highlights that one must step away from his judgments of what of what things are, and just to embrace them. But a certain question is put here, which is, how could you possibly do this as a rational creature? Your nature is to think, to judge, and to fight, right? Is a life devoid of opinion about such things even possible? And if it is, would it even be meaningful? His answer to that, again, is the sort of like quasi-Eastern answer, which is a delicate juggle between the mutually exclusive nihilistic materialism, understanding of the world, and a respect for the gods. Okay? So a passage that would highlight this would be, if the universe is governed by providence, then worship it and trust in his guidance. If everything is a random course of atoms, do not be governed by it, partially because there's nothing to be governed by, but instead be governed by your divine faculty of reason. So, again, there's an inescapable divinity in both of these conceptions, right? There's the divinity of reason, something that is given to you by your own nature, something that you cannot revoke, something that makes you godly, something that if you pursue, if you live in accordance with, you will live a good life. And if the world isn't made out of atoms, if this nihilistic materialism is not true, then the gods exist, and they are good, they are orderly, and they are the ones that command the cosmic order, something that you always ought to respect and embrace, because it will always be correct, it will always be good, because that is the order of things. And an orderly life is a good life, according to a Stoic. So this kind of places oneself in between a rock and a hard place, right? Because we have to hedge our bets. On one hand, we either have the gods that are willing to do whatever they want to us, and again, like the mythological interpretation here of what the gods are, how they act, and all of that is very similar to us for this particular context, like to what we would understand in the moral world. Let's not get too bogged down with the ideas of how mythology relates to morality and how the Greeks understand the behavior of gods, because it really is, in this particular context, similar to how we understand it today. But you know, if the gods are good and we need to embrace their decisions, then they are good and pure, and they give us providence. If they don't exist, then the only mechanism we have to deal with life is our rationality and sense of moral righteousness, right? A deeply emotional process, something that we have to embrace. But one thing is very clear, and I want to make sure that this is absolutely clear. When I say that, when Marcus Aurelius says that we need to embrace our moral righteousness, or implies that we have to, he also discusses throughout the book that one evolves their moral righteousness through the process of discussion, and one must be open to be persuaded, to have his mind changed. These are not permanent things. These are not constructs that are strict or prescriptive, but rather descriptive of what one finds reasonable. Okay, that is an important note that needs to be made here. But let's now talk about this idea of providence, because again, like I've mentioned this a few times. So providence can be understood as a consequence of a few things, right? First of all, is this rational order. right? The universe operates under the reason and the order of who made it. And fundamentally, that leads us to a situation where everything is unified, right? If the gods made everything, then we are all parts of a whole, and we are fundamentally united in our own nature as reason, as creatures with reason, right? Like throughout my notes of the book, I often, like, something popped into my mind, which is almost like Marcus Aurelius describes man as homo rationalis, right? The reasonable man, the man that thinks, right? And this idea is something that is permanent into all of his assumptions that he makes regarding morality, regarding aesthetics, regarding governance, and it is something that is very present throughout the book. And it implies that we are each part of a whole, and therefore we are intrinsically connected. Every event matters, no matter how small. It always fits into this cosmic order. And then finally, this pushes them to realize that we are deeply connected to the human experience and to everyone else that shares it. Again, this homo rationalis, this living with reason, this idea of virtue, of an orderly soul that pursues rationally what is good for all human beings, right? Again, reiterating all of these ideas once again. This leads to a deeply humanistic view of the world, and it's particularly well highlighted in 2:1, where he says, "Say to yourself every morning, today I shall meet with people who are meddling, ungrateful, aggressive, treacherous, envious, and unsocial. All of these things happen to them because they do not know what is good and what is evil. But I have seen the beauty of the good and the ugliness of the bad, and I recognize that the wrongdoer has a nature related to my own, not of the same blood or birth, but of the same mind, and possessing a share of the divine. Therefore, none of them can harm me, for no one can implicate me in ugliness. Nor can I be angry at my relative or hate him. We were born to work together, like feet, hands, eyelids, or the rows of upper and lower teeth. To obstruct each other is against nature, and anger or resistance is obstruction." So, again, there's a deeply humanistic conception of morality, and he often makes comments about that human beings are social creatures. So you either educate them or you put up with them, but you never ever reject them. You are never ever unkind. The pursuit of what is good for the social whole means that everything that is pro-social, it is good. Everything that is kind to the ones that are of the same kin as yourself is good. And this is something that is very important to keep in mind. So we can understand from this his way of understanding his place in the world. We can see that he cannot step away in any sense from his duty, because providence, again, this cosmic order, makes him be this way, because he is the emperor of Rome. So if you are born the emperor, providence says, be a good one. If you were Epictetus and you were born a slave, providence would say, be a good slave. You can never step away from your duty, right? So you have to be humanistic, right? This is a man that has the power to chop anyone's head off if he gets sufficiently mad. So he never does. He always chooses to be pro-social, to be kind, to accept people for what they are. There's no avoiding the universal order, because to presume that we exist is to presume our role in it. If our fate exists, then we must achieve it, since that is part of our place in this great plan. And as such, we cannot renege our place and duty towards our kin. We must exist in a pro-social unity, for that is the nature of man, that is the gift of the gods. That's why reason is divine. This profoundly humanistic view then has deep consequences in what he considers good and just, and very quickly we get to extract exactly why he made some of the policies he did. Right? If you really believe in this, then you would inevitably just be kind to slaves. You would care about the quality of the life that you are ruling over. And you cannot ignore this. The man is consistent. He talks the talk and he walks the walk. And yet, in some way, he never did that for anyone other than himself. He never did it for praise. In fact, he relentlessly rails against it several times in the book. Like, he just does it. So, Like another quote, like, fame in a world like this is worthless. Remember that soon you'll be forgotten, and soon after, those who remembered you will be forgotten too. Think of all the endless waves of change and the infinite time ahead, the emptiness of applause, the fickleness of those who seem to praise you, and the narrowness of the space in which is confined. All these should humble you, right? So again, like, there's this sort of we will touch upon this a little bit on, but let me elaborate on the on Marcus Aurelius' constant reminding of death. Memento mori is a deep and profound constant in all of this book. One must live in the right way, so one must die without regrets and full of dignity. That it is what matters, right? You will be dead one day. Everybody else will be dead one day. Why does it matter if someone's angry at you? Who cares? Live rightfully, live justly for the things that you ought to do exclusively. Death does not matter. Nothing matters but the present. Nothing matters but what you do right now and whether or not that is the right and reasonable thing to do. And not only that, he also rails against the people who give such praise, right? So not only he reneges praise, he also justifies that negation by the virtues of the people who give it. So like he says, think of the people whose praise you crave and what they're like. What are their principles and values? How easily they lose their temper. How poorly they judge others. How self-serving their opinions are. Think of all that and see how little reason you have to value their approval. It's a deeply, deeply caustic argument, right? This is as close to antisocial claims as one can make. But again, he's kind to these people, as we will see later. So here again, he states that the needs to be judged should be made against virtue itself and nothing else. Why do we care for the judgments of the wicked? If they praise us, what kind of praise is that? If they despise us, will they do so for good reason? Like there's a passage in the book where he describes the people who killed Socrates as lice, right? And that goes to show how much contempt he tries to hold back from these people, how much like he understands that in tough moments people will abdicate what is right and just and kill one of the wisest men that ever stepped on the face of this planet. Do not value the applause of the crowd, for it is fleeting and shallow. Instead, value the voices of those who live by reason and virtue, if such voices even exist. If not, be content with your own. Again, the profound loneliness of Marcus Aurelius, a man who has no equals, right? Being shown here. And the natural imperative is so great, and he is so thoroughly certain of his convictions that he allows himself to say, if anyone hates me, it is because they choose to do so, and not because I live in such a way that makes me justified in being hated. If someone despises me, and I quote, it is their problem. My only concern is that I should not do or say anything deserving of contempt. If someone hates me, that is their affair. My only duty is to live in a way that does not give cause for hatred. Profound idea. A very profound idea. And again, this leads us back to this idea that virtue, being its own reward, allows us to be on our own and stand righteous and certain. And why worry when you will die if you live in this kind of way? And everyone else will too. Soon you shall forget, and everyone who remembered you shall be forgotten. Death is merely change, and so you live while you can. You hold yourself to your opinions, and you have to trust in your own sense of judgment. And this is one of my favorite passages in the book where he says, everything you will see will soon alter and cease to exist. Think of many changes you've already witnessed. Changes here being death. He considers death as merely change, right? When the whole process of life is just a continuous set of more amoral changes, right, that we go through. And then he concludes this passage by saying, the universe is change, life is opinion. one, like the idea that reason exists, right? The idea that we live through reason is the idea that we live through our own opinion. And what matters is the opinion that we have of ourselves. And we must hold ourselves to the highest standard possible. Pursue your sense of virtue and never let go. But always analyze your conscience. Always avoid regret. Now, quote again: when you encounter someone's wrongdoing, immediately ask yourself, what is their perspective on good and evil? If you understand that, you'll feel compassion rather than outrage or anger. You can either teach them or accept them as they are. Again, this profoundly humanistic view. The same awareness should lead you to reflect on your missteps. Again, reason allows you to reframe your own judgments and evolve, to change, to improve yourself, and to never make the same mistake again. You too act out of ignorance or a false sense of what is right. Focus instead on virtue, for that alone is good. All else is indifferent. So pursuing the common good makes you righteous, because again, you do not see that being reflected in yourself, but rather on the well-being of everyone else around you. It is your duty. It is your divine order to improve the lives of your kinsmen. Marcus Aurelius also reigned during a period of great strife, as I said before, from 165 to 180 AD. The empire had a devastating plague, the Antonine plague, or the plague of Galen. This plague was possibly smallpox or measles, and was spread by soldiers from the Near East, like the wars during the siege of Seleucia in Mesopotamia, and was brought back to the empire. And it killed about 2,000 people a day, with an estimated death toll of 5 to 10 million people, which is about 10% of the total population of the empire. This event naturally causes a great impression on everyone, particularly Marcus Aurelius, profoundly shaping his view on mortality and the fleeting nature of human life. Right? Again, this is kind of where these ideas of there is no point in quarreling, there is no point in abandoning humanity, because soon you'll die, and everyone else will die too. And so you must do what is right now. Right? Because these events also like reinforce this view on duty and perseverance, because like you have to prefer what is right and truly important in a situation like this, because any decision that you make will inevitably incur in the death of thousands. Like you cannot avoid that. You've got a plague. So what do? Right? You have to do what is right. And so the situation was so egregious that the plague and like the wars ultimately led to the end of the Pax Romana, right? So as all of these difficult events unfolded, Marcus Aurelius needed a way of keeping himself sane, and he focused and a way of holding himself accountable. So he decided to write a book for himself as a journal, one that was never intended to be published. And this book reveals his deepest thoughts of himself, of the people around him, and all of the things he witnessed and how he rationalized them. But this idea needs reflection. What kind of man writes a book to himself? A book, by definition, is a means to convey a message. It presupposes that someone will read it. So what does it say about Marcus Aurelius that he would write such a thing? What kind of life does he live? So absent of others and so lonely. Mooring on the port of impossible virtue, he finds himself only being able to trust himself because no one else ever got there. So in a sense, he writes a book for himself, because he's the most lonely man in the world. He has no equals, he has no peers. And so what does one do in a situation like this, right? The unwavering trust in virtue, in providence, in the promulgation of the order that gives this man such a resilient personality that not even loneliness scares him. It's incredible. So what do? If you've conquered everything, if you've rose above everybody, what do you think about? What do you enjoy? What do you focus on? And so Marcus Aurelius argues that in nothing. You don't find solace in anything but the present. He argues that there is nothing else to an extent, that one must be focusing what is in front of him right this moment. A task, a conversation, your duty. And tomorrow you ask. Do what's right now, and tomorrow will take care of itself. Why worry about tomorrow if you don't have the control over the stars and the moon, and you can't make the earth turn any faster? And the only thing you have control over in regards to what is in the future is what you can do right now. So this next passage illustrates that and relates it to this idea of mortality. Again, we must fulfill our duty as our day-to-day. We must live in the now and not think about what we can't control. And so many other things stem from this core thesis, right? And again, there's a sort of like parallel with Eastern philosophy in the Western world. This idea of mindfulness, being here right now. So I'll quote, "You have been given three things, your body, your breath, and your mind. Only the last is truly yours. Leave behind the past. Let the future take care of itself. Focus only on the present, for it alone belongs to you. Think of this moment as your last, and you will live without distraction, passion, or regret. Live every moment like your last, and you will live without distraction, passion, or regret." Again, here we are again. Regret. This idea that one must avoid it at all costs. That one's very own life energy stems from it. That repulse for regret. It's almost impossible for us mortals, and I say us, but maybe I just mean me, I don't know, to believe that living like this isn't somewhat worthless. Almost like a parody of virtue. Something like so extreme that it's impossible to achieve, right? Like, it's sadomasochistic in a way, but to our brutishness, or perhaps mine, I don't know how about you guys, he's definitely a better man than I am, he would simply reply, the only thing that isn't worthless is to live this life out of truthfully, to live this life out truthfully and rightly, and be patient with those who don't. Right? Again, he never steps away from us. He's always with us, and he always tries his best to bring us with him. It is almost, in a sense, it's almost like we cannot help but think in a way that makes us lose our dignity, right? Consider all the choices that you make every day, the things that you regret, the things in which you recognize that you shouldn't be doing, but you do. And there's this ghost looming around you, haunting you every single time that you ponder about that thing. And you might think that it's your consciousness, but no, it's Marcus Aurelius. It's always there. He's always there haunting you, right? And he would just and again, it's as if we think that in that way that we would never be rewarded. Like, he would just say, well, virtue is a reward in and of itself. What do you want from me, right? Like, just live virtuously and you will always be fine. Just, that is the reward in and of itself. And so, if virtue is a reward in and of itself, what do you want from him? You live the life of a philosophy, you have everything you could ever want or need, right? And if you don't live in a virtuous way, well, then you're just exactly what he expects. A mere ball of flesh living like swine. But he would always be patient with us, as he understands our faults. And in a sense, it's hard not to admire Marcus Aurelius, but one would certainly never want to meet him. Imagine what it is like to look at such a mirror. What face will we see reflected in his eyes and facial expressions? It is not enough that he says that we must be of good disposition and that he must be kind to small men like us, because even though what he says even though he says and does these things, he also does everything else that we don't, right in front of us, right? So it is not enough that he treats us as part of the same whole and that we share the same divine spark, because his part is always bigger and his spark is always brighter. And I quote again, when someone wrongs you, ask yourself what their understanding of good and evil is. If you understand that, you will pity them rather than feel anger. Your response should be, it seemed right to them. Even if they were wrong, they acted according to what they thought was right. Show them the error if you can, without any rancor. But does he at least appreciate things in the way that we do? Does he relate to us at all? in any true sense? Does he find the same things that we do beautiful? Or are we so lonely and distant from him that not even that can be shared? And I just wanted to quickly touch on upon that sort of idea of beauty, like something that we can share with him in that sense, and talk about the aesthetics of the Stoic. And he says, there is a kind of river of things passing into being, and time is a violent torrent. For no sooner is each thing brought to the sight than it is swept away, and another is carried past, and that too will be taken away. Everything that happens is as usual and familiar as the roses in the spring and the fruit in the summer. Such is disease, death, slander, intrigue, and all the things that delight or trouble foolish people. What follows is the natural consequence of what went before. Nothing is isolated, but all things are interwoven, and the bond is holy, and there is hardly anything unconnected with anything else. For things have been coordinated, and they combine to form the same universe. So he sees beauty in the interconnectedness and natural flow of the universe. The fact that we share the same kind of existence with him is in and of itself the beauty of being a Stoic, or the aesthetic appreciation of a Stoic, right? Virtue aligns with accepting this order and living in harmony with it. And the fact that we are part of this order means that virtue is directly pointing at what is pro-social, and we've come full circle again. You can't step away from this idea of unity, this idea of providence. Everything links into everything else, and what is virtuous, in a sense, is always right. And in being self-evident, it manifests every time, and the conclusions are final. The mind's beauty is in its clearness and calm, by which it reflects a life lived in accordance with reason. That is the aesthetic of a Stoic. So once again, we run ashore this idea of order being the ultimate display of beauty. An ordered mind is a beautiful mind. Order is divine, and what is divine is beautiful, and what is divine is good. One must strive towards godliness. One must follow his nature, to be rational, to be virtuous, because reason is divine. So finally, to conclude, is it possible to learn about Marcus Aurelius and not appreciate the unique nature of a man who lived like a saint whilst ruling the known world? He lived a life of extraordinary virtue and resilience, embodying the Stoic ideal of focusing on what we can control while accepting the rest with grace. His reflections remind us that even in the face of chaos, whether the challenges of ruling an empire or the uncertainty of our own lives, we can find clarity and strength by aligning ourselves with reason and virtue. A man who earned this place in the Western mythos by sheer quality and vitality, and at the same time by sheer repudiation of these very same things, for he only lived for himself. He never cared about what we would think of him. He never thought that he would be remembered. He simply did what he ought to have done. No one can ignore such a character. No one can help but try to live up to the expectations of such a man, even if they never heard about him. Whenever someone thinks of Roman virtue, they think of Marcus Aurelius. When someone thinks about duty, resolve, and unwavering quality, one thinks of Marcus Aurelius. When someone thinks of becoming the best version of themselves, one thinks of becoming Marcus Aurelius. There is no escaping your conscience. There is no escaping your duty if you ever want to escape the person that you don't want to be. If you can ever dream of the person you want to become. Whenever you don't do what you must, remember Marcus Aurelius, how much he expects you not to do what you must, and how weak and pathetic you forever will be until you decide to live according to the nature he knew you had inside. And as he said, even in a place, it's possible to live a good life. This, of course, only if we don't disgrace ourselves. And the ultimate question will forever be, could you?